The disappearance of the Ninth Hispana Legion is one of Roman history's greatest mysteries. Although the Legion was once a formidable military unit of the Roman Empire, by the early 2nd century AD, it seems to have vanished from the historical record. Attempts to pinpoint the exact moment of its disappearance, the reasons behind it, and the fate of its soldiers have all led to intense scholarly debate. The Ninth Legion had a long and distinguished history. Formed by Julius Caesar, it participated in the Gallic Wars and fought in the Roman civil wars of the 1st century BC. Over time, it earned a reputation for its tenacity and effectiveness, a truly elite unit serving in various regions of the empire. By the late 1st century AD, the Ninth was stationed in Roman Britain, where the empire was still trying to assert full control over the island's indigenous populations. A building inscription found at modern-day York, dated to around 108, is one of the last undisputed mentions of the Ninth in Britain. In the early 20th century, historian Theodore Mommsen drew popular attention to the Ninth's disappearance, suggesting that the Legion had been annihilated by tribes in northern Britain. He based his arguments on the absence of the Legion's name from later Roman military records, and the fact that subsequent legions were brought into Britain to bolster defenses. This idea, attractive to many, placed the blame squarely on a catastrophic military defeat, possibly at the hands of the Picts or other warlike tribes of the region. Early sources, however, are scant. The writings of Tacitus, who detailed Roman campaigns in Britain, don't provide conclusive evidence of such a disaster. Although he acknowledged the difficulties Roman forces faced in controlling the northern territories, no specific catastrophic defeat was mentioned. That said, this may not be determinative since Tacitus wrote about the Roman conquest of Britain around 100 AD, which was likely before the loss of the Ninth Legion. Other key Roman historians who either lived during this period or wrote about this period failed to make mention of the Ninth. Suetonius, who was a contemporary of the period when the Legion vanished, made no mention whatsoever of it. However, historians argue that Suetonius primarily focused on imperial biographies rather than broader military history, which may provide an explanation for his silence. Dio Cassius was born about half a century after the Legion vanished from the records. He was known to provide significant details about military campaigns, as well as Roman governance, so his silence on the disappearance of the Ninth Legion is perhaps more surprising. Notably, of course, I need to mention that just because their extant records don't mention the Ninth Legion, doesn't mean these historians, or other historians, didn't write about the vanishing. Ancient writings are notoriously fragmentary, with much of Roman historical literature lost over time due to decay, wars, fire, flooding, or selective preservation. Surviving works often reflect specific biases or priorities, such as glorifying emperors or significant events, while overlooking seemingly mundane details. If the Ninth suffered a military defeat, which made an emperor or powerful family look incompetent, if it wasn't significant enough and happened in a remote place, it may not have made the record. It's important to remember that in ancient Rome, patronage was crucial for literary production of all types, including historical works. Wealthy patrons funded individuals like Tacitus and Suetonius for the purposes of glorifying their own names, families, and causes. This could be another reason for the lack of any meaningful mention of what happened to this legion. Others have speculated that since the legion was raised by Julius Caesar, who was by then a very much divine and near mythical figure, its destruction or disbanding could have hurt morale. In the absence of direct ancient testimony about the legion's fate, historians have turned to indirect clues. One line of reasoning points to a reorganization of Roman forces in Britain around the early 2nd century. Between AD 108 and the mid-120s, the Roman military underwent significant changes in northern Britain. Most importantly, this included the construction of Hadrian's Wall, built from AD 122, and the shifting of legions from one province to another. Some argue the ninth was not destroyed in Britain, but rather transferred to another frontier, possibly the Rhine or the Danube. Notably, there's evidence from Germania Inferior showing members of the Ninth Legion were transferred there. While some have argued that this indicates that the legion itself was definitively moved there, this is simply circumstantial evidence to suggest some members ended up serving there. It's been argued that the Ninth Legion might have met its end in conflicts on the European mainland in one of these frontier areas. Others suggest the legion could have been redeployed to the east, where tensions with Parthia and later the Bar Kokhba revolt might have led to its obliteration or absorption. When it comes to the ninth, the main puzzle is that no direct, undisputed record explains the circumstances of its departure. The Roman Empire's administrative systems were generally good at tracking legions, their bases, and their movements, which makes the ninth's disappearance all the more perplexing. Perhaps the legion was quietly disbanded, or maybe its records were simply lost. It's also possible that no ancient writer saw fit to chronicle its end, assuming it to be an unremarkable administrative detail rather than a grand event deserving of special mention. For instance, one of the prevailing theories that I briefly mentioned previously is that it was simply absorbed into other legions. Solving the mystery of the Ninth Roman Legion requires breakthroughs in archaeology or the discovery of new ancient writings. Archaeological evidence, such as inscriptions, military artifacts, or graves, could provide insights into the legion's fate, particularly if found in Britain, the Rhine, or the Danube regions. Similarly, uncovering previously unknown Roman texts or fragments, such as military records or correspondence, might shed light on the legion's movements or demise. Advances in technology, like ground-penetrating radar or tool-assisted manuscript analysis, enhance the chances of such discoveries. These tools could one day finally reveal whether the ninth fell in battle or faded administratively. On May 26, 1828, an adolescent boy with a strange demeanor appeared in the streets of Nuremberg, Germany, claiming to have been raised in near-total isolation. This boy would come to be known to the world as Kaspar Hauser. Since then, countless theories have been put forward regarding Hauser's background, his identity, and the circumstances of his baffling arrival. The historical details of Kaspar Hauser's first appearance are well documented. According to sources, a shoemaker encountered a teenage boy wandering the streets of Nuremberg, seemingly confused and barely able to speak. He carried with him a letter addressed to the captain of the local cavalry regiment. Within the letter, it was stated that the boy had been raised in isolation, never allowed to leave the house, and had been taught only to write his name. He had been taught to repeat a single phrase, which is generally translated from German as, "I want to be a cavalryman, as my father was." At the time, his age was estimated at about 16 years old. Soon after his discovery, the boy was taken into police custody. When questioned, he identified himself, awkwardly and haltingly, as Kaspar Hauser. He had difficulty walking and appeared to have limited knowledge of the world. Those who examined him noted that he behaved like a much younger child and seemed unfamiliar with everyday objects and social norms. This combination of innocence and confusion led to widespread speculation. Was Hauser a missing child from a noble family? Was he a victim of kidnapping and prolonged confinement? Or was he, as some skeptics claimed, simply a clever charlatan exploiting public sympathy? The intrigue surrounding Kaspar Hauser deepened as more people became involved in his care and education. One of his initial benefactors was Friedrich Daumer, a local schoolmaster and philosopher. Under Daumer's tutelage, Hauser made remarkable progress in reading, writing, drawing, and playing music. He seemed eager to learn, and his intelligence, combined with his startling backstory, attracted international attention. European newspapers picked up his tale, and he became something of a celebrity. One of the central theories that emerged over time was that Kaspar Hauser was in fact of noble birth. Specifically, some believed he was the hereditary prince of Baden, switched at birth for a dying infant, and later imprisoned to prevent his claim to the throne. According to this theory, his mysterious captors raised him in a small, darkened room, depriving him of normal human contact, all to ensure he could not pose a threat to the succession. Proponents of this idea argued that his appearance in Nuremberg was orchestrated by unknown conspirators, or perhaps the boy himself managed to escape. Supporters cited circumstantial evidence and rumored similarities in facial features between Hauser and members of the Baden royal family. Further, if this was the case, he would have been the son of a cavalry officer, which was in line with what he was taught to say. Another line of thinking posits that Kaspar Hauser was simply a foundling with a fabricated backstory. Skeptics have suggested that his story was too perfect, too tailored for sensational intrigue, and that his supposed ignorance of everyday life was exaggerated. Some contemporaries argued that he might have been a clever impostor seeking fame and fortune. He gave different accounts of his upbringing over time, and some of his recollections were vague or self-contradictory. Critics point out that if Hauser had been truly raised in almost total darkness and isolation, he would have had far more severe health problems, such as rickets or serious vision issues. Further, he would have almost certainly been completely nonverbal due to lack of socialization in his formative years. This, of course, wouldn't have been known in the early 19th century, as the understanding of the brain and psychology was virtually non-existent. Still, others have argued for a more psychologically complex explanation, suggesting that Kaspar Hauser may have been mentally ill or that he'd experienced severe trauma earlier in life. His inconsistent stories might not have been deliberate lies, but rather the result of memory issues or trauma-induced confusion. Without modern psychological evaluations, it's difficult to assess his mental state. Supporters of Hauser's authenticity cite that he genuinely seemed bewildered by the world and had unusual sensitivities, such as difficulty tolerating certain foods and lights. These could align with a person who'd lived in a controlled environment. A number of unusual incidents occurred surrounding Hauser. In October 1829, he was found bleeding and claimed that he had been attacked by an unknown assailant. In April 1830, he claimed a weapon discharged into his head by accident, but local physicians noted that the wound was extremely minor. Many thought this was another attempt to garner attention or sympathy. Notably, these incidents did attract more attention, and a British nobleman, Lord Stanhope, would take an interest in him. Lord Stanhope attempted to prove that he was perhaps the runaway son of a Hungarian noblewoman who fabricated the entire story. On December 14, 1833, he was lured to the Ansbach court garden under the pretext of receiving crucial information about his identity. There, he was stabbed by an unknown assailant and died 3 days later from his injuries. This sudden and violent end fueled further speculation. Those who believed in the princely origin hypothesis claimed it was a political slaying intended to silence him forever. Skeptics retorted that he may have done it himself to keep his name in the public eye, but that he may have gone too far. Given the extremely limited forensic science and investigative techniques of the time, the truth remains elusive. In the centuries since, Kaspar Hauser's story has persisted in literature, film, and scholarly debates. Modern historians, with the help of archival research and improved forensic techniques, have attempted to shed new light on his identity. In 1996, A study compared hair and body samples from items historically attributed to Hauser with DNA samples from descendants of the House of Baden. At the time, no definitive results could be reached. In 2024, modern DNA sequencing techniques were used and have likely definitively ruled out Kaspar Hauser as a member of the House of Baden. Notably, there's some dispute whether the DNA samples from Hauser are actually associated with him, given the 2 centuries that passed and uncertain chains of custody. While it's now clear that Kaspar Hauser likely wasn't a hereditary prince, this does little to solve the question of who exactly he was, and the mystery thus remains. In March 1944, Western Australia experienced a significant military mobilization known as the Western Australian Emergency. This event was triggered by reports suggesting that Japanese naval forces intended to attack the Perth and Fremantle areas. In response, Allied forces rapidly reinforced the region's defenses. Fremantle, located near Perth, was a crucial port during World War II. Initially, it served as an assembly point for Allied convoys traveling between Australia, the Middle East, and Europe. Following the outbreak of the Pacific War, Fremantle became a key operating and maintenance base for United States Navy submarines. Established in March 1942, the Fremantle submarine base eventually became the U.S. Navy's second-largest submarine base after Pearl Harbor. Submarines from the Royal Netherlands Navy and the Royal Navy also operated from Fremantle, contributing significantly to the offensive against Japanese shipping. Over the course of the war, submarines conducted over 300 combat patrols from the port. Despite its strategic value, the Perth-Fremantle area was geographically isolated, leading to concerns about its vulnerability to Japanese attacks. These fears peaked in March 1942 after Japan's rapid advance through Southeast Asia. Although several towns in northern Australia were bombed, Perth and Fremantle were not directly attacked. Nevertheless, apprehensions persisted. On March 5, 1944, the Australian government and military received an incorrect report that 2 Imperial Japanese Navy battleships had entered the Indian Ocean. Intelligence reported that they were possibly moving to attack Fremantle and Perth. In response, Allied forces in Western Australia were rapidly reinforced. The region's defenses were fully manned, air patrols off the coast were increased, and the 5 U.S. Navy submarines at the Fremantle submarine base were ordered to patrol the expected route. The Royal Australian Air Force's Western Area Command improved the readiness of its forces near Perth. Further, a variety of units were redeployed to Western Australia to face this upcoming threat. On March 10, 1994, air raid sirens rang out in Fremantle and Perth, though no air raid came. By March 20, 1944, it became evident that the perceived threat had not materialized. The air reinforcements that had been sent to Western Australia returned to their bases, and naval units resumed their normal operations. The leading theory is that the Western Australian Emergency of March 1944 was primarily the result of miscommunication and intelligence errors. Under this theory, the incorrect report about Japanese battleships entering the Indian Ocean led to a large-scale mobilization. Some historians suggest that such false alarms were not uncommon during the war, as both sides engaged in deception and misinformation tactics. While the official narrative holds that the Western Australian emergency stemmed from faulty intelligence, some have suggested a more clandestine theory. According to this line of reasoning, Japanese naval or special operations units may have penetrated regional waters closer to Western Australia's strategic ports than previously admitted. Given the strategic importance of Fremantle as the United States Navy's second-largest submarine base after Pearl Harbor, operational security would have been paramount. Any successful Japanese infiltration there, even a minor one, would have risked undermining confidence in the Allies' ability to secure Australia's western flank. Thus, a top priority would have been to swiftly eliminate the threat and ensure that no alarmist reports reached the populace. In order to maintain morale and public support on the Australian home front, authorities would have had strong incentives to completely obscure such an event. News of even a small-scale Japanese intrusion might have reminded Australians of earlier attacks on their soil and maritime zones. Throughout the war, northern parts of Australia, such as Darwin, Broome, and other coastal towns, had been subject to bombing raids and reconnaissance flights. The memory of these incursions loomed large. Residents knew that Japanese forces had the capacity and willingness to strike the Australian mainland. Admitting to a successful Japanese penetration of Australian waters, however fleeting or ultimately unsuccessful, might have handed the enemy a propaganda victory. All that said, the declassification and public release of archival records, including military communications and intelligence reports, make it increasingly unlikely anything was concealed. More likely than not, the Western Australian emergency can be explained through a mixture of faulty intelligence reports and a populace and military suffering from war exhaustion.